Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content.
Senior Lieutenant Irina Sebrova pushes the control stick forward, sending her Polikarpov PO-2 biplane into a steep dive. The engine chugs as the converted crop duster struggles under the weight of its passengers and cargo. It may only travel at 60 miles per hour, but it produces so much noise that her comrades refer to it as the typewriter. Through almost complete darkness, with wind whipping at her face through an open cockpit, Sebrova can barely make out the silhouettes of the German barracks in the moonlight. The enemy is there, and her little plane, made of canvas and wood, offers her no protection from rifles or pistols, let alone the machine guns and anti-aircraft cannons protecting the Nazi base. Irina Sebrova can't afford to be seen or heard, so she kills the engine. The plane glides in, almost silently, just the sound of the wind whipping against her canvas wings. She fights the controls to line up her target. When she has the barracks in her sights, she pulls the lever to release 500 pounds of high explosives directly onto the enemy's heads. Wing Commander Sebrova has hit her target. Now all that's left is to turn the engine back on, pull out of this dive, and escape with her life. Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and I am here once again with Brandon Fibbs, writer, producer, director, podcaster. Brandon, welcome back to the show. You were here for Apollo 11, and it's good to have you back again.
It's always nice to be invited back.
Brandon, you were an original editor on like some of the early episodes of the show, right?
I was. I saw how the sausage was made.
Yeah, when you came on last time, you were talking about, I was like, are you familiar with the format? And you were like, yeah, I edited several of these in the early days, so yes. I'm familiar with the format. I've heard you talk before. Well, it is great to have you back.
Thank you.
And like I said, last time we were talking about Apollo 11, but this time we have a different story from aviation history, and one that has always been kind of a favorite of mine to talk about.
Yes.
We are going to talk about a World War II aviation unit, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, better known as the Night Witches, which is just such a good name for a regiment.
Oh my God! If there isn't a better badass name for a military regiment, I don't know what it is.
Yes, the Night Witches. The Nachthexen is even better in German.
Which is not always the case. So yeah, but it is.
Yes. Sometimes the German is 75 letters that are all
right.
and sometimes
smushed together.
Yes. Yeah, I think I read that flak is it's like a condensed version of what the Germans call that weapon, like the anti-aircraft cannon. There's some giant word for it that just basically translates literally to like the cannon that wards off pilots, and it's like this huge, and they just called it flak because it was shorter than saying the whole thing.
I don't blame them.
So speaking of flak, Brandon, why don't you kind of give us a really brief overview of what we're going to be talking about on the show today? Who are the Night Witches, and why does this one particular regiment seem like kind of stand out from the rest of the badass aviation units of World War II?
Yeah, you bet. The Night Witches are one of those things that I think we as Americans, at least the American listeners, frequently, we have this bad taste in our mouths, depending on how old you are and if you grew up in the Cold War, for the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is obviously not misplaced. But at the same time, there are a lot of stories that come out of the Soviet Union, particularly during World War II, when the Russians were our allies, that are just some of the most extraordinary stories of the entire war. And here we are talking about Russia at its darkest period in modernity, in which just to if you don't mind, I'll just set the scene. It's 1941. Operation Barbarossa is it's the largest invading force in the history of warfare. It is 4 million Axis troops pushing their way into the Soviet Union, going straight to cut Moscow's jugular. And some of the worst battles of the entire war, some of the most horrific German atrocities, they all happened here. They starved the Nazis starved millions. And just for even some greater context, the Soviet Union lost more people than anyone else in World War II by a massive margin, 27 million people. And of that 27 million, 8.7 million were military, and twice that number were civilians. So this was just a dreadful period in Russian history.
27 million is larger than the populations of many countries on Earth.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just unbelievable death and destruction. They had the Blitzkrieg, and the Russians, or the Soviets, I should say, did not have an answer for it. And within weeks, it's Kyiv is falling, and, Leningrad's under siege. And the country is getting, the Soviet Union is getting stomped early on, and a lot of people are dying.
Exactly. And yet, they managed to push the Russians back and then join the Americans and crush Berlin's windpipe. And a lot of that success was owed to the witches. And these witches weren't flying around on brooms, but rather wooden planes under the cover of night. But they were no less scary, and they were no less effective. And this is one of the single-handed coolest stories to come out of World War II. And it is an all-woman aviation troop, all-woman pilots, all-woman crews, all-woman engineers, mechanics, administrative, supply, everything. And they helped save Russia from annihilation in World War II.
Yes, and that is really the thing that makes this unit in particular stick out. Is down to from the pilots down to the technicians loading the racks of belt-fed machine gun ammo. That it is all female pilots and crew in this regiment. And as Russia is getting, or as the Soviet Union is getting kind of stomped by Germany, and it is their darkest hour, right? Moscow is under siege. There are not enough men. There's not enough equipment. And these women get called into service to defend the motherland. And they're
half of them weren't called into service. They were pleading to be put into service.
Yes. Yeah. They volunteered. And they're going to be doing it with some tech that is not up to par for what should be used in this war. So let's take a really quick break for a commercial here, and then after that we're going to tell the story of the Night Witches and their battles in the air above the Eastern Front of World War II. So welcome back to the show. It is kind of early 1942. Operation Barbarossa has begun in 41. The Soviet Union is losing badly. They're getting beaten. They're retreating. They've lost huge parts of their territory. And now they're kind of defending Moscow. They're defending Stalingrad. The Germans have pushed as far as they are going to push in, but they've pushed deep into the heart of Russia, and things are looking pretty bleak. And that is when this unit gets called up into action. And Brandon, you had alluded to it before, but the women that joined this group are not conscripts. They're not draftees for the most part. They are volunteers.
Yeah. Colonel Marina Ryskova was kind of officially dubbed as the Russian Amelia Earhart. She was a pilot who had wanted to be an opera singer when she was a kid, and some things happened and that didn't work out. And so she became the Soviet Union their first female navigator. And all of a sudden she found herself a colonel with connections to Stalin himself. And she was getting waylaid with letters, just hundreds of thousands of letters from women across the country, wives and daughters and mothers of all of the Russian servicemen saying, I want to do my part too. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Russians, as you alluded to, are in a make or break situation. This is dire, and everyone's stepping up, including tens, if not hundreds of thousands of women. And so she convinces Stalin that he should form female combat regiments. And if they hadn't been in such dire circumstances, he probably never would have done it. But he was desperate. And from that, she was able to form 3 new regiments, including the 588th Night Bomber Regiment that you alluded to before the break.
Right. And kind of what you said in the beginning was really valuable here, and really is kind of at the forefront of everybody's minds, which is that twice as many Soviet civilians are dying as Soviet soldiers, right? So these women, and there's this kind of tendency at this time period in history to be like, oh, well, war is for men to fight. But these women are in danger if the Nazis come and overtake their town. These women are just in danger, and they have to fight to defend. Like, they're in this war now. This is total war. This is war that we haven't seen on a scale like in a very, very long time. And and they get called into action, and they want to come into action. And so they sign up for these units. So they don't have too much trouble filling the ranks of these units. No. And you get these women who came from all over the country, and women could fly. That wasn't that uncommon for women who had some knowledge of how to fly in the 1940s. But we have never really seen it in combat before.
That's right.
So these women sign up and they go into training. And I'd come across some stories from training. There was a woman named Irina Sebrova. She was a wing commander in the 588th, and I had read her autobiography a long time ago. And she kind of says, the war was on, and the Soviet Union is on the brink of collapse. So these women, they have to cram basically 3 years worth of air combat training into 6 months.
That's right.
Which seems intense.
Not only did they have to cram all those years of training that the men had had into just a couple months, but they weren't training just as pilots. Every single woman in the 588th, they trained to be pilots, they trained to be navigators, they trained to be engineers, mechanics. They all knew how to do every single person's job so that they were interchangeable. And when you consider then, it would be amazing enough if it was just the pilots learning all of that stuff in just a couple of months. But the fact that they had to learn how to fix the aircraft, maintain the aircraft, and navigate the aircraft is astonishing.
Yes, that is amazing. And this is hard work. It's 6 months of basic training, but it is 18-hour days, no days off. Saturday, Sundays, you're still training. And then a couple of nights a week, the commandant would simulate an air raid by waking everybody up in the middle of the night and then marching these women around the tarmac barefoot in the middle of the Russian winter in basically Siberia. So it sounds like a pretty hard training setup.
Yeah, and to paint a picture for you, these are not like older women. These women are in their late teens and early 20s. Mm-hmm. Like the average age was like 18 to 26. So I think sometimes, obviously, war will do something to you and kind of crystallize maturity in a way that non-wartime times do. And I think we would have a hard time sometimes thinking about high school and college age anyone, not just women, particularly even men, going off and doing these great things. But history has shown throughout times of turmoil and trouble that it's young people step up and do the most heroic things.
Absolutely. That is a really important thing to keep in mind, is that these are young women and men fighting these wars. And that's always kind of you picture the action movie hero version of this, but like sometimes these kids were they were kids, right? They were 19 years old.
They were literally kids.
Mm-hmm. But there is like a very intense training session here for these women that are going to create these units. And one of these units, one of these aviation units is the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They are officially formed in 1942, and they go to work fighting the Nazis during the Stalingrad campaign as one of their first campaigns. Now, let's talk for a second about the gear that these women are issued, because one thing that the Soviet Union is low on manpower. They have people, and they will get some people mobilized and shipped out from Siberia, and they will put together a large army eventually. But at this point in the war, most of their trained military personnel is prisoners of war or casualties or just massively overworked. So they are hurting for people, hurting for like active duty service people. And they're hurting for equipment. They're running out of, you always hear that story from Stalingrad where the one guy carries the rifle and the other guy carries the ammunition to pick up and like just grab go out there, and you don't have a rifle, but find a rifle off a dead body when you get out there. And for this all-female pilot like bomber unit, they are not issued the top of the line, they're not issued MiGs here.
Oh, I mean, it's more than just the plane. They're issued the oversized hand-me-down uniforms of their male colleagues. These gigantically, oversized things. There weren't boots to fit their small feet, so they were given men's boots, and then they had to rip up all their bedding and stuff the boots full of mattress fluff just to fill them out.
Wow!
And as if that's not hard enough. And in addition to all of the, being treated, I think, with a certain amount of disdain and skepticism and sexual harassment and stuff like that, they were given old, rickety, armorless plywood and canvas biplanes. These things are from the 1920s. They're trainers that had been used for crop dusting, and they're expected to turn the tide of the war around flying these old biplanes.
Yes, exactly. So it's the Polikarpov PO2. It is, it looks like the Red Baron. It looks like canvas wings, plywood body, crop duster, big propeller in the front. And
it's decades obsolete already.
Yes. And it is going to go up against ME-109. It's going to go up against real stuff, right? So they're going to have to fight a Focke-Wulf with this thing. And it was so flimsy that it was susceptible to ground fire. And I don't mean like an anti-aircraft gun on the ground. I mean like
a rifle.
I mean like a dude running outside of his tent with a rifle and shooting it up in the air could shoot through the wings and body of this biplane.
Right.
And it was a two-seater. So there was a pilot and there was a person that would sit behind them, a navigator.
The navigator,
The navigator didn't have a radio, but did have a machine gun.
But not all of them did.
Yeah, that's true.
So that the plane was woefully inadequate, and yet it also had some advantages, which is to say that it's so small and so light that it's not going to show up on radar. That's good. Mm-hmm. And, and something I learned when I was flying in the Navy and flying a patrol aircraft, and those planes I was not going to be taking out anyone else in any sort of dogfight, but the turn radius of my S-3 Viking with its giant tail fin was such that I could evade at least one time any sort of fighter jet, because my turn radius was so much better. He would have to arc way around and come back and get me. Now, of course, he could do that one time and let a missile off and get me. But the analogy is the same here, because the German Messerschmitts would literally stall out if they tried to match the biplane's speed, because they couldn't go that fast, or I should say, they couldn't go that slow. So that there were things that made these planes kind of optimal for what they had to do. But yes, you're right. They did not have radios. They didn't have radars. Most of them did not have guns, and weight issues being such a thing, they didn't even have parachutes. They couldn't bring parachutes. The only tool they had to bring, everything had to be on paper with a pencil for their navigation, and pretty much the only tool they had at their disposal was a pistol to use on themselves should they ever be shot down over enemy territory.
Right. That World War I thing of you shoot yourself so you don't burn to death, right? That was an old World War I thing where they didn't have parachutes then. And if your plane catches on fire and you're going down, you're going to die. Just shoot yourself.
Yeah, and you said that they were open cockpits, which is true, completely open cockpits. And we're talking about Russia. We're talking about Russian winters. It's the very thing that killed so many Russians. It's the thing that luckily bogged the Nazis down in the end, was these numbing winters. And these women were constantly getting frostbite every time they went up, every time they touched the skin of the aircraft, their skin stuck and ripped off. Like it's the most harrowing situation and an aircraft platform you could possibly imagine.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you hit like my favorite statistic about this PO2, which is like the top speed of this thing is like 90 miles an hour, which is slower than some cars, slower than many cars. And yeah, the ME-109 has a rough combat speed of 350 miles an hour. But that was what you said, where like you couldn't slow down. The Messerschmitt would
fall out of the sky.
Yeah, if it tried to travel at 90 miles an hour through the air. So, but these women, they developed some tactics for how to use this thing, right? Because it doesn't show up on radar, but you can see it, and it's loud. It's a loud biplane, and guys on the ground can shoot at it, and anti-aircraft can shoot at it. Germans have flak guns, they have AA guns, they have Messerschmitts, they have equipment to deal with this sort of thing. But these women were very creative in how they chose to attack the Germans.
Yeah, they took those challenges and basically used them to their advantage, flipped them and used them to their advantage. So their job wasn't to bomb sites and try to destroy machinery or something like that. Their job was literally to try to harry the Germans on the ground to such a degree that they couldn't sleep, that they were demoralized, that they were just constantly feeling as if they were always under attack. And so, you mentioned 1942, June 8th, that was the very first mission. And with that, the Soviet Union became the first nation to officially allow women to engage in combat. But the only way they were able to make it work is if they flew under the cover of darkness, because they were so vulnerable. So they decided to go at night. They'd fly in a 3-plane formation. 2 of the planes would try to draw the enemy fire below. And as you said, a well-placed shot from a rifle or a machine gun would take this out, much less artillery or flak. They would use 2 planes to try to lure the enemy away, and the third would drop the bombs. But to ensure no one could hear that giant propeller coming, the bombing plane would cut its engine and simply glide out over the target and drop its bombs, and then hopefully be able to escape, re-engage its engines, and be able to escape in all of the explosions. And it was that sound, that air rushing past the canvas and the wings and stuff like that. It was as it was going there without any sort of mechanical advantage, that made it sound like it was like a whooshing sound, like a broom, like a witch on a broom. And it's one of the things that gave them their name, the Night Witches, because that scary sound.
Yes. Yeah. I love that. Right. Because they would turn the engines off, and that's wild. Like, I guess you would know more about this than me, since you were a pilot, and I've never done that. But it seems like trying to fly in glider mode is significantly more difficult than when the propellers turned on.
Yeah, I wasn't a pilot, by the way. I sat behind the pilot. I was like a cross between Goose in Top Gun and Jonesy from The Hunt for Red October. But yeah, you never want to turn your plane off. I mean, would you want to get going down on the freeway and then just literally turn your engine off and just see how long you lasted? It's that same sort of idea. Well, people are shooting at you. Yeah, that's not an optimal situation.
Okay, I just need to pause here for a minute, and let's hear from our sponsors.
I love this idea of you had to one would try to distract them, one would attack, and they're doing this. They got 500 pounds of bombs on those wings. They're flying in. I think they might have called them. I think I saw one time that the PO2 was referred to as like a typewriter, because it was so loud. It sounded like somebody typing on a typewriter when the engines were on. And yeah, they would have to turn it off at a certain distance. Yeah, it would be totally quiet except for this kind of whistling or whooshing of the canvas. Then the bombs are dropped. They cut the engines back on and fly out of there and hope that they can get away before the Germans can scramble fighters to come after them.
That's right.
And then the Germans, they're getting bombed by this every night, and that's when they kind of come up with this name. They know that these are women doing this. They know there's women in those planes. They're shooting down some of them, and some women are dying in combat here. And it's the Nazis are kind of like, what is this? These night witches, right? I saw a great quote from a pilot, Lieutenant Galina Brock-Beltsova. She says, "We slept in anything we could find, holes in the ground, tents, caves, but the Germans have to have their barracks, They are very precise. So their barracks are built all in a neat row, and we come at night after they're asleep and bomb them. Of course, they run out in the night in their underwear, and they're probably saying, 'Oh, those night witches,' or maybe they called us something worse. We, of course, would have preferred to have been called night beauties, but whatever, we did our job." It's just like such an awesome way of summing up how the mentality of these women on these missions.
Totally. And the funny thing is that like the Germans were simultaneously in awe and enraged by this.
Yes.
And the Night Witches got so good at what they did that the Germans gave an Iron Cross automatically to anyone who shot one of these planes down.
Whoa.
And the Germans were constantly talking about how these women must have been given some sort of special injection or something that allowed them to see at night. Like something was like, they can see at night like cats. And it's some sort of like the Russians are doing some sort of medical experiment to make them better and superior, which of course the Night Witches themselves, when they heard this, there's one quote in which one of the pilots was like, well, that's nonsense, of course. What we were clever. We were educated, and we were very talented girls. Talented girls on a mission to save their country.
Yeah. And so they would sleep during the day. They'd hide their planes and then go out at night. And the Germans, they're getting bombed during the day by the Sturmovix and by Yaks and by other Russian aircraft that can get over there. And then these guys are fighting in battles all day. These guys are in Stalingrad, right? Like, could you imagine you fight Stalingrad all day long, and then at night you're trying to go to bed and somebody starts dropping bombs on your tent? Like, that changes, over the course of days and weeks and months. That gets to you, right? That makes you not want to fight as hard. It affects your combat ability. And
it was relentless because their planes didn't actually carry that many bombs. Some of them could hold 6, others quite a bit fewer, I should say, bombs. And so these women were constantly dropping their payloads, returning to base, being rearmed and going back out again. And it was regular for them to take sometimes up to 8 and sometimes even 18 missions per night. It was just nonstop dropping bombs on the German front.
Yeah. Irina Saburova, she flew 1,008 night missions in her career and 92 day missions, which is just wild, right? Like I always think of Memphis Belle and like the 25, they do 25 flights in a bomber and you can retire or whatever. But she would have completed like 44 tours of duty, I think, if she'd flown 1,000 plus missions.
That's right.
And, there's another story. There's some stories of, other heroism during these battles where like sometimes these planes were pretty old and they would carry those bombs, but it was fairly common for the bombs to not deploy when you push the button. And like there are stories of like the navigator having to like climb out onto the wing to manually hit the bomb with basically a hammer to drop it off so that it'll fall, like in the frozen Russian winter at night while she's being shot at. Pretty amazing stuff.
It was an amazing group. And yet it was so awesome. Like when you read up on these guys and like in their spare time, when they're not like being these incredible warriors, they sleep by day and, warriors by night and stuff like that. But they, given all the rationing and all the things that they couldn't find on the front, they would use their navigation pencils to paint their lips and give themselves eyeliner and stuff like that. It was just funny. They would paint flowers on their planes, like some of these little like things where you might be tempted to think this is some sort of stereotypical joke right before they come swooping over the top of you and plaster your barracks with bombs.
Right. Yeah. And, there are some, many of these women are killed in action. And some of them have some pretty close calls. I know Saburova was shot down twice. And in both times, like, machine gun from the ground puts some holes in your wing. Maybe you don't have to, maybe you're ship doesn't catch on fire, but you do, anti-aircraft fire can cut fuel lines and wings and things like that and damage your aircraft enough that you have to land. And for her, there's at least 2 stories of her having to land behind enemy lines, and then, her and her navigator having to sneak back. They said that they would kind of just try to avoid the gunfire and generally head east in the hope for the best, There was one time that she got shot down and her navigator was wounded, so she had to drag her. And they get to this boat that's going to cross one of these rivers where it's on the battlefront. And as the boat is going across, the Germans are like dive bombing it with Stukas. And she's like so mad talking about this. She was so upset. But the thing that made her upset was that she got shot down on her first sortie of the night. And she was like, I'm not going to get to go back up again. I'm going to miss the whole night.
Yeah, it's the most extraordinary experiences. And we alluded earlier to Colonel Reskova, who started this entire thing. She was one of the victims of this. She also did not survive the war and died heroically on one of her missions, and ended up being the very first state funeral of World War II that the Russians did, and buried her ashes in the Kremlin.
Wow.
So it just goes to show just how extraordinarily she was looked upon, and their actions looked upon. I mean, by the time the war ended, like the Night Witch's last flight was on May 4th of 1945, just 3 days before Germany surrendered. And they were within 37 miles of Berlin. Like, it was another couple of days. Had the war gone on any longer, the Night Witches would have been dropping bombs on Berlin itself. That's how close they got. That's how much they pushed to help the Russians get right up to infiltrating and overcoming Berlin.
Yeah. The 588th, they fight in the skies above Stalingrad and contribute to that battle turning and the war turning. They fight through the rest of Russia, Poland, Ukraine, into Germany. They are kind of, just behind the front lines on all of these major engagements as the Red Army is pushing forward and dropping bombs on the Nazis nonstop for years. And yeah, Raskova is a really interesting story because she was like you said, she was the Amelia Earhart of the Soviet Union. She was a famous aviator, and she organized this unit and put out the call and trained these women, but she was out there flying with them, which, there's something to be said for that she was willing to get out there and do it as well. Which I think is very, very heroic.
Absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned how many, missions they went on and stuff like that. Like, by the end of the war, they had flown just under 30,000 bombing raids,
wow,
which on average is 800 per plane, 800 per pilot, per navigator, I should say. And they dropped more than 23,000 tons of bombs on the targets. And yeah, you said it, quite a few of them died. Yeah, of the 261 women who served in the regiment, 32 were killed in combat, which doesn't sound like a gigantic number, but is a pretty significant number when you consider, all the different jobs that the women were doing within the squadron.
Right. And and so they are able to get through the war and help turn the tides of the war. There are other women pilots who are successful in the war for different units. You had mentioned that there were 3 different regiments of female pilots. The 2 that come to my mind always are Lydia Litvak. She was the fighter ace. She flew in the 587th Fighter Regiment. She flew a Yak, and she shot down somewhere between 13 or 14 German aircraft over Stalingrad. They called her like the Lily of Stalingrad or the Rose of Stalingrad, and she's the only woman fighter ace that we know of for like shooting down more tthen 5 enemy aircraft. She also did not survive the war. She was killed in action at like age 21, as we said. 21. And then there's a woman named Anna Yegorova. She flew a Sturmovik, ground attack fighter, and she had done several missions, or something like 300 missions, something like that. And she was shot down and captured, but survived, escaped capture. She's like another really interesting character. And then Irina Sibrova, the one I was talking about, where I read her biography, she earns Heroine of the Soviet Union. So she survives the war. She's named Heroine of the Soviet Union, which is like basically the Medal of Honor for the USSR.
Yeah, it's the highest distinction the Russians had.
Yeah,
and they gave out 24 of those for the Night Witches.
Yeah,
so,
which is a huge percentage for any other.
Yeah, huge percentage.
Yeah, massive percentage compared to other units. They eventually rebranded them as like a guards unit, I think. Right? That was like they promoted. If you were like a really famous regiment, you could get promoted to being a guards regiment, and that's what happened to the 588th. And then. Then after the war, these women, a lot of them kind of return home, but some of them go on and stay with the Red Army or the Red Air Force to fly planes or to be test pilots. Sibrova became a test pilot working on jet fighters and stuff. I think it's just an amazing story.
It's absolutely an amazing story. I mean, when you think about it, you've got, they had shitty planes. They couldn't hardly carry any bombs. Next to no one believed they were capable of doing this. And yet they become crucial to, the Soviets winning the war. And one of the things I love about this story is that everyone in Russia knows who they are. But most people in the West have never heard of them. We're very selective about the stories we tell about Russia. And I think that all comes about after, because of the Cold War. Even when, alluding to the last time you and I spoke during the space race, like America rarely talks about Russia's accomplishments. We only focus on our own. But these women were instrumental in not only winning the war, but showing the world that women were every bit as capable of men. And they did it without the proper equipment, support, or even respect. So, I mean, it's just, this is the story. These are the sorts of people and sorts of women that should be heralded a lot more. Everyone should know who these people were.
Yeah.
Who these women were.
Absolutely. I think we should write the movie of this.
Oh, they've tried several times, and there are a couple different versions out there. Even there's even an American film that went into pre-production but never got off the ground. Wink, wink. Several years ago. But yes, I mean, it's a no-brainer. Like this story and and another famous story that you may have already covered on this podcast, the female snipers in World War II, the Soviet snipers in World War II, who were basically every bit as incredible as the Night Witches, but they were just, doing it on the ground with guns. When you empower some of these women and you put them in a life or death situation, they not only do as well as the men. Most of the time, they're blowing the guys out of the water. These are just some of the most extraordinary warriors that modern warfare has ever created. Yeah,
you mentioned the snipers. We haven't done them on the show yet, but I have written about Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She was Ukrainian, and she was fighting in Stalingrad for the Soviet Union, and They claim that she shot like 300 something sniper.
Yeah,
sniper
I think
wild.
She's the one who was nicknamed Lady Death, right?
Lady Death, yeah.
Yeah, Lady Death.
Yeah. I remembered the name of Anna Yegorova's autobiography, and it was like Red Sky, Black Death. I was like, that's a good name for an autobiography.
Also, somehow sounds so very Russian.
Yes, exactly. Yes, this is the country. But yeah, absolutely. So that is the Night Witches. They were they were women who stepped up when their country needed them the most, and they came from all over the Soviet Union. So mostly Russians, but you had Ukrainians in the unit, and you had Belarusians and people from other parts of the Soviet Union. And these women, their country was imperiled by a group that was just kind of wantonly killing Soviet citizens, and they stepped up and they made life really, really hard for the people invading their country and fought them off. And became heroes in their own country, and like you said, are largely unknown outside of that. But I think that is changing, and hopefully it will continue to change.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a very good reason that at the end of the war, when the Russians were having to surrender, they didn't want to surrender to the Russians. They wanted to surrender to the Americans, because it became very clear the extent of how brutal the Nazis were to the Russians and how many millions they killed including, as we said, twice as many civilians who died, that you just create a really dark resentment. And there's nobody wanted to face the Russians. None of the Germans wanted to face the Russians and have to surrender.
Yeah, I remember reading a book by a guy named Wolfgang Faust, and he was a tank commander in Nazi Germany at the end of the war. I mean, he was through the whole war, but he tells a story about like some town in Germany was surrounded by the Russians or the Soviets, and he and the last guys of his army unit and many civilians from that town were like, we got to break out and get to the Allied line so we can surrender to the Americans instead. Like, we can't surrender. We can't let the Soviets take this town. And so they had like a breakout of that village to try to get to the Allies. They were like, we're going to die here, or we're going to surrender to the Americans.
That's right.
Wild stuff, right? But that was a very brutal, very bloody war with a lot of terrible stuff happening to civilians, which is not cool. Well, that is, I think, the story of the Night Witches. Brandon, do you have anything else that you wanted to kind of mention with this?
No, I think that covers it well.
All right. Well, Brandon, thank you so much for coming back on the show and talking to us about the Night Witches.
Thank you.
This is such a good story, and I love thinking about this. You know, these tiny little biplanes being piloted by these Nachthexen bombing German positions. Brandon, where can people find more of your stuff?
You can find me on TikTok at Stay Curious, my friends, where I daily post science and history content. And you can find me my podcasts, 9 Days in July and American Football, and too many to list. But that's a good place to find me there.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. And
anytime.
And thank you all so much for listening. We appreciate having you here with us, and we hope to see you again on the next show. Stay badass. Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are me, Ben Thompson, Dr. Patricia Larish, and Andrew Jacobs. Writing is by me and Pat. Story editing by Ian Jacobs. Mixing and music and sound design by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeartRadio. Badass of the Week is based on my website, badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions or ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and tell your enemies. And please leave us a rating. We'll be back next week with another one.